The Mill, a RazedRainbow fic. I wish I could remember what led me down to the riverbank that day. Maybe I was thirsty. Maybe I wanted to skip stones. Maybe there was no reason at all. Personally, I like to think it was the hooves of destiny that pushed me to the water's edge, but then again, I'm not sure. Whatever the case may have been, I went to the riverbank. In the end, that's all that really mattered. I was standing beside the river, watching the water collide with the rocks to create a thundering rapids. There was such a beauty to the rapids, powerful enough to suck you under, yet still retain the unfathomable elegance that water just seemed to have. It's no surprise to me that ponies still get lured into the old river, only to be swept away by its currents. It's so mighty and at the same time so compelling. I still feel the desire to go for a swim when I head down that path. It's a stupid urge, but an urge nonetheless. It was while I was watching the water careen that I noticed a reflection. Something wooden jutted out of the tree line, its lower half caressing the water and its upper half tickling the tree limbs. I turned my head, convinced I was just seeing things, and saw this large wheel. The water rushed against it, ramming into its body with a seemingly more intense force, and the wheel spun, an insistent, irritable squeaking coming with each rotation. I moved close to the wheel and noticed that it was attached to a large stone building, a mill. It was clear the mill had been unoccupied for many years. The stone it had been constructed from was weathered and moss-covered. There was only one slanted window in the front, glassless, and the doorway lacked a door or hinges. I wasn't an expert in architecture, but even my young filly mind could tell this building was ancient. Of course, being a silly filly that I was, I also decided the building had once belonged to a brave knight in shining armor, and I had imagined the interior of the building was filled with skulls and pelts of manticores, goblins, or whatever else that knight could have slain. That theory was quickly disproved. The only forms of life, past or present, were cobwebs in the corners and mouse holes on the walls. Still, despite its obvious age, I felt compelled. The structure was still beautiful, and it was still in good enough shape that, with a few patched holes, in addition of a door and windows, it could be occupied. I had fixed up some things in the past, most notably that old tree house on my family's farm. I had always considered myself pretty good at it, and so I decided to give it a shot. There was no harm in trying. And that's how it started. Just a decision made on a whim, with no real expectations or foreseen consequences. If only it had stayed that way. The mill had proved to be in need of a lot more fixing up than anticipated. The whole thing was as structurally sound as a piece of lint. Several times I was in the middle of patching a hole when half the roof decided, right then and there, it wanted to kill me. How it didn't succeed is a miracle. But I weathered the storm. While it was difficult and dangerous work, a voice in my head told me it would all be worthwhile in the end. The hardest part was keeping it a secret. I knew that if my sister and my brother found out, I'd have to stop. "It ain't safe," they would say. "I feel they shouldn't be doing such things." And I knew I wouldn't hear the end of it, so I made sure to stop by the creek right near the apple orchard every evening. I'd scrub away the dirt, paint, and blood, and I'd groom my mat of my fur in such a way that it would hide any cuts or bruises. After I was sure that I was relatively spotless, I would head in for dinner. My family's suspicions were never piqued, and for that I was thankful. Hiding my solo adventures from my friends was another difficult task. Well, we had made a pact that we would attempt to earn and eventually earn our key marks together. If they caught wind I was going out on my own, crusading without them, they'd throw a hell of a fit. Unlike my siblings, my friends grew suspicious. They'd catch me walking out of the forest late in the evening, battered and bruised. They'd ask where I'd been, and I'd say I was just going for a walk. They would ask why I was covered in scratches, and I'd answer I had fallen through a thorn bush after tripping over a rock. While I wasn't the best liar in the world, it was convincing enough. They'd shrug and go on their way, and I'd breathe a sigh of relief and keep working. Getting the materials I'd need was both the hardest to accomplish and most difficult on my soul. Being on a farm, I was surrounded by materials I needed to fix up anything and everything. Crowbars, hammers, screwdrivers, wood, carts, you'd name it. I had it all at my hooves, just waiting to be picked up. However, they weren't my tools. They're my family's tools. And I wouldn't be stealing, but borrowing them without permission was still a big no-no. I would have to ask, and I knew that my request wouldn't go without question. They'd ask what I needed them for. They'd ask where I'd went. and I wouldn't be allowed to go anymore. It was a lose-lose situation. I was forced to choose between the sanctity of my soul and the mill. I chose the mill. The mill took months of grueling labor to refurbish, but I managed to do it, all alone with no help from any pony. Something in the back of my head told me that even then, that nobody would ever notice my hard work. The mill was too far off the beaten path. One had to actually go off trail through the woods to catch a glimpse of it. Yet, I was still satisfied. I did this for myself. Somebody else noticed it and liked it, good for them. Maybe they'd use it as an inspiration for a painting or a song. Maybe they'd see it and decide to turn it into something useful, like running a mill that could produce things. Or maybe it would stay enshrouded. I didn't care. The mill was my pride and joy. Nothing could take that away from me. I wiped sweat off my brow and limped my way back into town. I grumbled and winced with each step. A misjudged step on the path of the mill had led in a twisted ankle. While cuts and bruises could be hidden easily, hiding a limp would be near impossible. But I bit my lip and kept moving, and sweat and tears mixed, hopefully convincingly. And I walked rather normally by the time I emerged from the forest. The sun was setting in the west, covering the sky in a brilliant sea of red and orange. I stopped to admire it, and that was my mistake. With a shout, Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo shot out of the bushes. They had done this many times before, so much so I didn't even jump in surprise anymore. Whose raised they pointed at me? Questioning glares etched on their faces. A sea of generic questions spewed from each of their mouths.
Where were you? What were you doing? Why are you limping? What the hay is on your flank?
That last one took me by surprise. My eyes grew wide, wider than Scootaloo's at the time, and I turned my head. I cried out when I saw it. My voice cracked more than Sweetie Belle's when she had made the observation. Yellow hair was no longer so occupant of my flank. A hammer and paintbrush now resided there as well. My cutie mark. A tidal wave of emotions cascaded through my brain. Excitement, fear, sorrow, reject, and joy. I had finally done it. I had finally earned my cutie mark. Yet, the most prominent emotions were the negative ones, the ashamed ones, the frightened ones. I couldn't look Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo in the eye. To do so would bring me face to face with the ponies I had wronged. We had a pact, and I just broke it. Earning our cutie marks together was supposed to be our tether, something that kept us connected even when we grew older and farther apart. The intent of mutually acquiring our cutie marks was what brought us together, and it was what was going to keep us together, and I had ruined it. Without so much as acknowledging their ragged breaths of muttering of what, I lowered my head and shrugged toward Sweet Apple Acres. I knew that when I got there I'd be found out for a heathen, found out for a liar, found out for an unapple. The shame weighed down on my heart, and I started to limp again. The apple family had a history. If you were an apple, a true apple, you'd have an apple cutie mark. Even if you were meant to be an accomplished actor, an apple would appear somewhere on your flank. That was the mark of a true apple, and my flank was without it. At first I had hoped, that it was a matter of perception. I hoped that the lighting was just too dim for me to see the apple, or the apple was located in a spot I couldn't see no matter how far I cracked my neck. But that was just wishful thinking. As I bent over the creek to wash the grime and tears off my face, I caught a reflection of my flank. It was a hammer and a paintbrush, and nothing else. Not even an apple seed. I felt the sudden urge to end it right there. As crazy as that sounds. Not even fully grown, not even out of school, I considered drowning myself in the creek. But at the time I was lost and confused. I knew that nothing good was going to come from this mark. I knew that nothing good was going to come out of walking through the front door of the house. I knew that nothing good was going to come out of tomorrow or the next day or the day after that. And I knew I was wrong. Or at least what tradition said was wrong. It wasn't an apple. I doubted I was even a pony. The hurricanes of emotions and thoughts carried from civil twilight to absolute darkness. They'd be looking for me soon, and I debated whether I should give them the benefit of finding me. The lights were still on in the farmhouse, and I could barely see the silhouette of my sister's hat as she paced in front of the window. Her loud, twangy voice audible for nearly a kilometer away. I bit my lip, and I started to cry again. What am I going to do? I looked up at the moon. It was brighter than I could remember it ever being. To this day, I don't think I've ever seen it as bright as it was on that night. There was something comforting in it. A glow that embraced me and told me that things were going to be okay. While it didn't console me completely, it was enough. I washed my face off in the creek one last time and then marched towards the house. They were on me as soon as I opened the door. Scolds, questions, hugs. Big Mash and Top had me wrapped in his 4 legs so tight I could barely even breathe. Things settled down after a minute, and questions became more decipherable.
Where were you?
What were you doing?
Why are you bleeding?
What the hell is that on your flank?
I didn't lower my head this time. No. I raised my chin as high as I could, made my flank as visible as possible. If they were going to hate me for what I wasn't going to give them the pleasure of damaging me. They could disown me, they could sling their rocks and insults, but they would not have victory. I wouldn't allow it. Applejack bent down, furrowing her brow and squinting her eyes, and looked. She looked at the mark, then looked at me, then looked at the mark, then looked at me. Just fire the damn gun already, I thought. Stop with this hesitation and put me down. She stared directly into my eyes, her own tidal wave of emotions evident in her gaze. This was it. This was the moment everything crashed. She laughed a genuine laugh and pulled me into a hug. The air was knocked out of me, partly out of the intensity of Applejack's embrace, partly out of complete shock. This wasn't the laugh of a bully. This was the laugh of a friend. The laugh of some pony who loved me.
You got it, Apple Bloom! You finally got it!
She choked out, her voice muffled against my shoulder. I looked at her perplexed. You ain't mad? I asked. She looked at me with her own perplexed expression.
Why the hey would I be mad?
As I sighed, I pushed her away lightly. I shook my head forlornly and looked at the mark. Look at it, Applejack. Notice something? Notice something not there? Applejack tilted her head and placed a hoof under her chin. She stared at it for a long time. Too long for my patience. There ain't an apple, Applejack. Just a hammer and a brush. I fell to my knees shaking. I'd promised that I wouldn't give them the benefit of breaking me. But breaking promises seems to be the only thing I can do at the moment. I ain't an apple, I sobbed. I ain't an apple. I sniffed and hit my head against the floor with a loud thunk. My tears seeped into the cracks of the floorboards and flowed through them, much like a river. Then Applejack embraced me again, shushing me. Then I felt the strong forelegs of my brothers wrap around me as well. Finally, I could feel Granny Smith's frail hooves on my back, trembling with age and emotion.
You are an apple.
Applejack whispered in my ears.
And you're my sister, and I love you. Don't you dare think otherwise.
I began to cry again, but this time it was an actual release. No fear, no anger, just release. Things weren't going to be bad. Or at least, not all bad. I still had to go talk to Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo, apologize for breaking our pact, as well as apologize for marching off without an explanation. Whether or not they would forgive me was a mystery, but on that night I didn't care. I was hungry and tired. Words could be said tomorrow. To this day, the mill stands unoccupied. I considered moving in there from time to time, but I quickly brushed it off. Although I feel I did a fine job sprucing up the place, the mill ain't exactly the most comfortable house. Besides, nothing can change what it did for me. And while I'm thankful I stumbled upon it, I feel the most respectful thing I can do for it is just leave it be. It's fine, just the way it is.
Hi, this is Chuckles, and I will be reading Her Sword, Shield, and Friend by Cavemonkynick. Hope you guys enjoyed the show.
I must say, Your Highness, I love watching you work. You're especially radiant at your fullest.
Flattery will get you nowhere, Captain.
Princess Luna said sharply, having just placed the final star in the night sky. But when she turned to me, she was smiling, a smile that I eagerly returned.
You can't blame a pony for trying, I replied.
I suppose not,
Luna said, dropping her severe tone. As captain of the Lunar Guard, I was often at her side. In the time since her return, almost 2 years ago now, we had grown to be close friends.
Is there anything on the agenda for tonight?
No, ma'am. The night is yours.
Excellent. Shall we venture out and enjoy it?
I would be honored. Allow me to inform the watch that we are leaving.
Of course, and I shall inform my sister. I will meet you in the courtyard.
And with that, Luna spread her wings and was off. I cantered back down the tower stairs and was about to call for my second in command, when my only superior, save the princess herself, came around the corner. I snapped to attention.
Captain Shining Armor, sir.
At ease, Nightwing, I'm off duty.
He replied. I relaxed. You're here late, I said, falling easily into casual conversation.
Yeah, Cadence is in Manhattan making an appearance at some event, so I figured I'd get caught up on some paperwork.
I hear you. So you headed over to the watch station, then?
Yep, I'm about a week behind on the logs.
Would you mind passing on a message for me to, well, whoever is on duty tonight?
You don't know? You're losing your edge, aren't you?
Shining laughed and tapped me playfully on the shoulder.
Cut me some slack. Bottleneck is sick and the schedules got shuffled, I replied, laughing as well.
So, what's the message?
Princess Luna wants to stretch her wings a bit and I will be accompanying her. Silent Rain is in charge until we return.
Another night out with the princess, you lucky dog, you.
Oh, come on, it's not like that and you know it.
I'm just messing with you, I'll let you know.
Thanks, and don't work too hard. I'm sure Cadence wants you to be well rested when she gets back.
Not funny.
You started it.
Fair enough. Take care, Nightwing.
You too, Shining.
I made my way to the courtyard to find the princess waiting for me.
Ready, Your Highness?
Of course.
She replied. She turned and lifted off, and I spread my own wings and followed her into the night. After a short flight, Luna and I sat down on one of the few clouds populating the sky. The view was breathtaking. From our perch, we could see for miles. Canterlot, Ponyville, even the Everfree Forest. It was all beautifully in the gentle light of the full moon.
It feels so good to be out of the castle,
Luna said.
Indeed it does, Princess.
Nightwing, I've told you. Outside of the castle walls, we're friends. Please call me Luna.
Sorry, force of habit.
Silence fell as we took in the scenery. After a few moments, I finally spoke.
It's been too long since we last did this.
Luna didn't respond. I looked over to her, and she was staring at the moon. Its likeness reflected in her light blue eyes. Luna? I called to her. Failing to mask my concern, she blinked slowly and then turned to look at me.
Yes.
She said softly.
Are you all right?
Just thinking.
She shifted her gaze back to the moon.
That did not answer my question.
I don't know.
You're thinking about her again, aren't you?
You speak as if we were separate entities.
Luna.
I still feel her at times.
We all have our dark side.
That's just life. Light will always cast a shadow. What matters is that you don't let the darkness control you anymore.
The princess that I serve is kind and gentle. She cares for all of her followers despite their social status. She's a joy to serve under, and I have the honor of being one of her closest friends, an honor I cherish deeply. Now I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound anything like Nightmare Moon to me. She thought a moment.
Thank you, Nightwing. That means a lot.
She looked back at me and smiled.
Anytime, Luna. Now let's go have some fun.
And what, pray tell, do you have in mind?
Well, I glanced towards Ponyville. I thought we'd just see where the night takes us.
I like the way you think.
And with that,
we were off.
As far as I'm concerned, flying is one of the greatest joys that this world has to offer a pony. I've been flying for nearly 20 years now, and it's never grown boring. Tonight was no exception. I glanced over at Luna and winked. Before she could respond, I pitched my body to the left, drew in my wings, and fell into a dive. My stomach rose into my chest as the rush of the free fall flooded my veins with adrenaline. I saw a small lake below me and angled my body to shift myself over to it, then streamlined myself as much as possible, gaining speed. I watched the lake grow larger as I fell. At the last second, I opened my wings and pulled out of my dive, leveling out mere inches from the surface of the water. I dipped my back right hoof in the water, creating an impressive wake, beating my wings to make up for the drag. As I approached the lake's edge, I withdrew my hoof from the water, but kept my elevation. The landscape below me transitioned from water to sand, and then to grass in quick succession. A small hill bordered the lake, telling me that it had probably been dug out a long time ago as a reservoir or something. I traced its slope with my body as it climbed a bit before gently giving way to an open field. Not far in the distance I could see Ponyville. There were a few less lights still on than I had expected, considering how early it was. I allowed my momentum to taper off before dropping my hooves to the ground, matching my speed at first and slowly coming to a stop, just outside of town. I stood for a moment, catching my breath. There was a soft rustle as Luna landed at my side.
Quite a performance,
She said.
And to think you dropped out of flight school to join the Royal Guard.
Best decision I ever made, I replied. She simply smiled and scanned the horizon.
Ponyville seems rather quiet tonight.
Yes, the pink one must be asleep.
Nightwing!
Luna scolded, though she was just laughing.
Be nice!
Her laugh was contagious, smooth, beautiful. Just like her. I shook the thought from my head. Where had it even come from?
Nightwing?
Luna called. Huh? The thought had thrown me. I had been staring. Oh, sorry. I zoned out for a second.
Is everything okay?
Yeah, everything's fine, I said. Probably a little too quickly. I think that dive just caught up to me, that's all.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she hadn't bought it, I could tell. What do you say we drop in on Twilight? I don't even think I've seen her since the wedding.
You think she's still up?
Of course. She does most of her reading at night.
Do you think she'll mind if we drop in?
Not at all. That was all the convincing she needed. It didn't take long to reach the library, and Twilight was overjoyed to have us drop in. How have you been, Miss Sparkle? I asked as she showed us in.
I'm doing quite well, Captain.
She replied, following us in to our usual back and forth. I trust the young Master Spike has been on his best behavior as of late.
As good as can be expected of him, I suppose.
Did I miss something?
Luna chimed in. Twilight and I just laughed.
Nightwing is a good friend of my brother, so we know each other pretty well.
Twilight explained. Yep, shining is half the reason I earned my position.
Well, thanks for that heads up.
Luna said.
Sorry, Princess.
Twilight sighed.
Say, I was looking through an old book, and I came across a spell I can't quite get my head around.
Let me take a look at it.
Luna replied, and with that the two of them flew into a conversation I couldn't dream of understanding, which was probably a good thing. While they pored over the tome, I slipped outside to be alone with my thoughts. The cool night air was refreshing. I made my way around the side of the library so that I was not next to the road, and then sat in the grass inside. How could I let myself get so emotionally attached to Luna? She is the princess of the night, and I'm just another Pegasus. Then again, how could I not? Once we had gotten to know each other better, she had started requesting my presence more often, just wanting a companion to talk to. But still, she's the princess. It's against every regulation in the book. I went back and forth with myself like this for hours, my head fighting my heart until a voice snapped me back to reality.
Nightwing?
I jumped to my feet. Luna was sitting beside me.
Sorry.
She said softly.
I didn't mean to frighten you.
It's fine. I just didn't hear you come up, I replied.
I've been sitting here for nearly 10 minutes.
She deadpanned. Oh. Managed and looked away.
Is everything okay?
Yes. I lied.
Are you sure?
No.
You know you can talk to me.
I know. It's just...
Just what?
Can we go somewhere private?
Of course.
I led her to the edge of the pond I had flown over earlier, and we sat at its shore.
Now, what's bothering you?
She asked. Well, I searched desperately for the right words, and for the courage to speak them aloud. I think I might... Finally, I just closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and... I think I might love you, Luna. I think I might love you, Luna. The night stood still, stunned into silence as the words hung in the dead air between us. The silence stretched on for what seemed like an eternity. It was deafening, maddening, unbearable. I summoned all the courage I could and opened my eyes. When I looked at Luna, she seemed fixated on the lake, her expression empty. I wanted to speak, but what was there to say? The silence continued. I turned my own gaze to the lake. I started to feel foolish. Luna finally spoke.
How long?
I'm sorry? I looked up to her again. She was still staring at the lake.
How long have you felt this way?
I could not read her voice. I don't know. A while, I suppose. But it only really struck me tonight what the feeling was.
I see.
I'm sorry. I know this is wrong.
Why is it wrong?
She turned to me. Her eyes were piercing, but not harsh. Well, because you...
Because I'm what? Your superior? Royalty? A goddess?
Why isn't this bothering you?
Should it?
Yes, it should. Couldn't sit still anymore. I stood and began to pace along the shore. I am the captain of the Lunar Guard, and you are my charge. Every rule in the book screams that this is wrong. I am supposed to check all emotion at the door, but... My words caught in my throat.
But?
Turned to her. Her expression had changed. She seemed almost amused with me. Somehow I found my voice again. But when it's just us, rank and royalty don't really seem to matter anymore. I resumed my pacing, my mind taking a left turn in desperation. Before the Guard, I was pathetic. I didn't drop out of flight school, I flunked out.
What difference does that make?
I don't know, maybe none, but I feel like I owe you the whole story. Maybe if I hash this whole thing out, I can figure out how I got here and whether or not I'm a total fool.
You're not a fool.
Somehow this broke the tension for me, and I laughed. I'm glad some pony thinks so, thank you. Still though, need to clear the air.
I understand.
When my mom was pregnant with me, she got real sick. Near the end she took a turn for the worst. There was nothing they could do. The doctors barely saved me. I grew up frail. I wasn't necessarily weak, but I had no stamina. Flying was especially exhausting, but I was determined. When it came time for me to head to flight school, I put everything I had into it. I excelled at the academics, highest marks in my class, but I just didn't have the strength for the actual flying.
Surely no one blamed you.
Luna half-asked. Of course not, but that didn't make it any less humiliating. So I made my decision. Cloudsdale had nothing left for me. I left a note for my father and left. In hindsight, it was a really stupid idea. I barely made it to the ground without giving out, and after I landed I couldn't even see straight. Stumbled around for what felt like hours, but probably wasn't but a few minutes, and then I blacked out. I woke up in a hospital in Canterlot, still too weak to move. The nurse asked my name and I made something up. Didn't want to get sent back to Cloudsdale. She told me that a member of the Royal Guard had found me on his way back to Canterlot and had brought me in almost 2 days ago. Once again I was lucky just to be alive. That evening I had a visitor, shining armor. Turns out he was the pony that found me. When he asked what had happened, I told him everything. Don't know why, but I felt like I could trust him, and I was right. He took the story in stride and promised not to run me home. Said my life was mine to live. After I got out of the hospital, he let me stay in his guest room until I got the rest of me strength back. I already had it in me head that I wanted to join the Guard, and he actually encouraged me. He pointed me to the Lunar Guard, and they were hurting for recruits. It was rough at first because I was still frail, but I felt like I belonged. A point that was proven a few weeks in when I earned my cutie mark. Full moon, bearing the mare in the moon, and a bat-like wing and wrapped around half the moon's circumference. That's when the guy started calling me Nightwing.
Wait, Nightwing isn't your real name?
It is now, but it wasn't always. My name used to be Devin Windlebane.
Quite a mouthful.
Luna giggled. It's a family name, my great-grandfather or something. When my dad asked why I changed it, I told him that I didn't want the name of any other pony to define who I was. Which is Horseapples, of course, but he bought it.
So you did see your father again?
Yep, about a year after I joined the Guard, I had started to make a name for myself and decided it was time to face him. So I took a few days' leave and flew up to Cloudsdale, testament of how far I had come. First he didn't know what to say, so I told him that I'd only left so I could become some pony who'd make him proud. He told me that I never had to leave to make him proud, that I was his son, and nothing would ever change that.
Do you still talk to him?
Dad lived just long enough to see me make captain 6 years ago. He passed a few months later. Celestia rest his soul.
I'm so sorry.
Don't be. We had long since made our peace, and he's with me mom now. Anyways, after I got used to my duties, my life fell into routine. It was glorious at first, but it quickly became apparent that something was missing. Could never quite put my hoof on what, and I was just about to chalk it up as nothing when you made your return. At first the feeling of something missing was forgotten. I was too busy with new duties and an influx of new recruits. Later when things slowed down, it started knocking around the back of my head again. Then the responsibility of the night was returned to you, and all at once you had changed. Until that point you had remained behind closed doors almost perpetually.
We still spoke back then.
Luna pointed out. I remember, after the first nightmare night that you spent in Ponyville, you opened up a bit, but you were still hesitant. When you did come to me, it was usually with a question about current culture or something.
Those talks meant a lot, you know.
I'm not belittling them. I'm just saying, once you had the night back, your demeanor changed. You had purpose again, and it made me think of, well, me.
I believe I'm starting to understand.
Yeah, so do I answered. How about you?
What do you mean?
How do you feel about all this? The silence fell again. I turned to face her. She glanced at me but wouldn't meet my eyes. Something in the back of my head started to panic. Before it could spiral out of control, she spoke.
I don't know. I know I care about you, but anything deeper than that I still don't understand. For 1,000 years I was alone, with nothing but my own anger and jealousy. I'm still rediscovering who I am.
For what it's worth, you put up a great front, I said without thinking. She looked at me.
I owe a lot of that to you. I think it's best if we take this slow.
I nodded my agreement. We should probably be getting back to the castle. We've been gone quite a while.
You're right.
We flew back to Canterlot in silence, both of us deep in thought. I found myself strangely content. True, it wasn't the perfect ending, but that was frankly unrealistic. When I resigned myself to tell her I was positive that she was going to shoot me down without a second thought, I never thought my feelings maybe returned. I couldn't help but smile. There was hope. Hope that one day I could truly make her happy. And for now, that was enough.
Hello, this is Chaotic Harmony, and I will be reading A Good Apple by CelestialBrony. Sadness is a cold, wet blanket that we can't always pull off ourselves, but it makes all the difference when some pony will stay under that blanket with you and take the bitter chill away. From the starlit equestrian sky above Applebloom's head, snow fell in big, wet flakes onto the landscape below. The ground was too warm, and the snowflakes were too wet to collect in an icy blanket across Equestria. And so each flake disappeared into the eaves of the apple orchard and the grass beneath them as silently as they had fallen. Applebloom sat with her back against the barn, much like a certain teal unicorn, her rosy amber eyes hidden behind the lids on which her tears had been collecting for several minutes. A feeling of loss that only Ophelia could feel rested itself oppressively across her heart, and almost silently, Applebloom began to weep. She wept for the loss of who she felt may have been her closest friend. She wept for a hole in her heart that would be left aching and empty until her hooves walked upon the clouds in pony heaven, and she wept for what she could have done. Applebloom reached behind her head and undid the knot that bound her pink ribbon in her mane, bringing it around into her lap. Her eyes blinked once, twice, and thrice as her tears fell into the ribbon and mingled with the melting snow that was already soaking through the fabric, which is always so thick and warm. She thought back to her first day in school, and how upset she was to be given such a gift. Her gaze shifted to the silvery moon that shone down on her from above, a shimmering speck that splayed in 3 spots across her gleaming pupils.
No, Granny, I won't wear it. I won't.
Applebloom's eyes squinted, and her teeth gritted in defeat as Granny Smith's deceptively quick hooves fastened a rosy pink ribbon into the scarlet curls of her mane. She turned around and opened her mouth in protest, but Granny Smith spoke first.
Now, Applebloom, you might be the only filly at that school with a ribbon in her mane, but...
But, Granny!
No buts, Applebloom!
Granny Smith rose to her hooves, only to fall back onto her rocking chair.
There's a story behind that ribbon. Your big sister Applejack wore the ribbon when she was just a filly, and she didn't give any fuss, so don't you.
Granny, I'll wear it, okay?
Applebloom's day at school hadn't been as unbearable and as torment-filled as she made it out to be that evening. In fact, Miss Cheerily thought it was the biggest and loveliest ribbon she'd ever seen. Applebloom wrapped the ribbon around her neck as she would a scarf, as an unforgiving wind washed through the orchards and over her damp coat, soaking her limbs to the bone. She did not shiver. The bitter cold in her heart chilled her so much more as her eyes rested on the intricate memorial that sat in the ground before her. Her breath caught in her throat as a deluge of recent memories, all good ones, began to pour into her consciousness once more. Rather than seeing the memorial before her, she now saw herself running, playing, and lying on the grass in the sun with her lost friend. Applebloom had crafted the memorial herself, demonstrating a level of care and attention to detail that her crafting labor had never seen before. As deep into the snow-capped soil as Applebloom was tall, bricks were laid on top of bricks, functioning as a foundation at the base of the memorial. On top of the brick surface was a small headstone, carved from a pristine block of oak. Applebloom wouldn't tell Twilight Sparkle what the oak was for, But seeing Apple Bloom's distraught expression had been more than enough to persuade her to fulfill Apple Bloom's request. The day before, Twilight had enchanted the wood for Apple Bloom so that the sun, wind, and rain would never be able to deface the oak. Apple Bloom's chiseled inscription would remain etched into the oak, long after the stars above died out and were born again. Here lies Hoppy. He will always be missed, and he will always be loved. He was as good as an apple as any pony. Apple Bloom couldn't remember starting to cry once more, and neither could she remember her brother joining her at the side of the barn. But there he was. How some pony as big and bulky as he was could move so quietly baffled the little filly. The presence of some pony familiar gave her a small kind of comfort. Her agonized sobs were quieted to a soft murmur as Big Mac's muscled foreleg wrapped itself around her from her right, pulling her gently close to him. Big Mac had always been patient with his little sister, and he never pushed her to say anything. He held her and shielded her from the silent snow where the pink ribbon could not. He sat quietly with her for a long time, as he was always rather quiet. As Apple Bloom again depleted her reserves of tears and grew quiet, she shifted herself in the shared embrace to look up at Big Mac. He was actually holding back tears, but hid it very well with his stalwart expression and pleasantly colt-like smile. He scratched her ear with his other hoof before a big, wet snowflake could melt upon it.
You made that, Apple Blossom?
He spoke softly, a touch of both sympathy and admiration in the depth of his voice. Apple Bloom's ear flopped at the sound of her big brother's pet name for her. He had always been protective of her, and although Apple Bloom loved every apple in the family, Big Mac and she had always been particularly close. The Apple family was as supportive of their foals as any pony, but it was always Big Mac that she would go to when she had a hard day at school, and it was always Big Mac that always seemed to be there to cheer her up when she needed him to be.
Yeah, Twi used her magic to make it last. I really hope it worked.
I'm sure it did.
He paused.
That Hoppy of yours must have been something real special for you to put all that work into his grave,
Apple Bloom sniffed. A mat of her curly, scarlet mane fell in front of her eyes as she nodded. Granny Smith would push her into getting a haircut sooner or later. The two sat against the barn, even longer still. Big Macintosh petting his sister like he would Winona. He provided more than enough warmth for both of them. Apple Bloom leaned into Big Mac, joining him in audience of Luna's argent moon. At the time, it hung in the sky, shining down on the orchards of sweet apple acres through the only open space in the cloud cover available to her. The grass extending from beyond Hoppy's grave to the red Gala apple orchards seemed to be hidden from the world outside. The snow now fell silently in an immaculate frosted veil that draped itself gracefully and neatly around the clearing that brother and sister sat in together. It was as if the elements had granted Apple Bloom her own domain, separate from the rest of the world, hidden from its troubles and scrutiny. Big Mac made himself a mental note to write a brief poem about this winter wonder at a later time. An obscenely large snowflake landed in Big Mac's left eye, and as he wiped it away, Apple Bloom couldn't hold in her filly's giggle. Big Mac laughed too, and gave her a pat on the shoulder.
You want to tell me about him, Apple Blossom?
Yeah.
She paused, and gloom touched her voice once more as she rested her gaze on Hoppy's gravestone.
He didn't say much to me, you know, 'cause he couldn't. He was the bestest jumper I ever saw. He's a lot bigger than any of his friends, but he was the only one who didn't run away from me. He was just a cricket, you know? You probably think I'm real silly now.
She blushed. Big Mac just hugged her.
There's nothing silly about being sad.
Apple Bloom smiled. Just a bit.
We had a lot of fun. He jumped through hoops and on lily pads, and he was real good at jumping away right before the frogs could get him. He even stayed in my window at night and waited for me to wake up. He made these funny noises.
He must have been a real friend then.
Yeah.
And for the third or fourth time that night, Apple Bloom couldn't remember. She buried her face in Big Mac's side and cried. She cried until the tears would no longer come. She grew as silent as the veil of snow and the silvery moon above. She asked,
Big Mac?
Yeah, Apple Blossom?
Why did Hoppy have to go?
Big Macintosh grew as silent as he usually was.
I don't know. And I'll bet Hoppy didn't either. But you can still have fun and smile, Apple Blossom.
Apple Bloom sniffed.
How? I can't make him come back.
Big Mac smiled and lifted Apple Bloom's chin to meet his gaze.
Hoppy was a good friend, Apple Blossom. Even though he didn't say goodbye.
He couldn't.
What would he say to you now, Apple Blossom?
Big Mac looked at Apple Bloom, and Apple Bloom to the moon.
I don't know.
I do.
Apple Bloom looked at her brother with the face that exuded awe and skepticism at the same time. He saw this and smiled, knowing his job was about to be done.
He'd tell you to run, play, and have more fun without him than you did with him.
Apple Bloom's mouth hung open for a moment, and she looked at her brother again.
But wouldn't he be mad?
Big Macintosh laughed genuinely, and Apple Bloom blushed and buried her face into his side again. He started petting her mane.
I'm sorry, Apple Blossom. I'm not laughing at you. He was a good friend, though. He wouldn't get mad at you for having fun. He'd want you to be happy.
Apple Bloom was quiet. Big Mac looked down at his sister as Apple Bloom looked up at him, and a feeling of victory, like no other, settled on his heart, much like the snow that had fallen around them. Apple Bloom was smiling. She was smiling ear to ear, and the gleam in her eyes was unmistakable. His little Apple Blossom was happy again. She hugged him. Hard.
Ouch! Apple Bloom, you're hurting me.
She giggled.
You're too big for me to hurt, Big Mac.
No, I ain't.
Yes, you are.
Big Mac laughed and gave Apple Bloom a scratch behind her ear. She leaned into him again, this time in affection rather than sorrow.
Thanks, Big Mac.
He wrapped his iron forelegs around his sister and hugged her gently, smiling to himself.
Apple Blossom.
And it's that time that everyone hates, the time we end the show. For those of you who wish to submit fictions to us, the email to send them to is RazedRainboom@gmail.com. That is RazedRainboom@gmail.com. If you didn't quite catch that, don't worry, it's on the screen. Make sure to include fanfic on the subject line, and also put a link to the fiction in the email. Keep in mind, not every fanfic will be read, so don't rage at us if they aren't. Any comments or suggestions other than fanfics can be sent to us at that email as well. Also, as stated before, we have a set of rules for fictions, which are 1. The fictions must be PG-13, no exceptions. 2. The fictions must be completed. 3. Authors can submit their own story, but cannot be selected without fan support. 4. Fics should not be too short or too long. 5. Not too many key characters. We have a limited crew. I hope you all enjoyed watching this show as much as we did making it. And now, it is time to leave. Read on, every pony. Read on.